On page 51 of the Encyclopedic Dictionary of Sociology, Richard Lackman defines colonialism as the process by which political, social, economic, and cultural dominance is acquired and held by a foreign power over another people and land. The first evident piece of history that could be labeled as colonialism dates back to roughly 8th to 6th century BCE, also known as the era of antiquity. The Phoenicians maintained their maritime network surrounding the Mediterranean Sea, holding small colonies within each. Other civilizations would follow suit after, but the most prevalent, transformative era of colonialism that has shaped what our modern world is today would be Europe's powerhouses expanding to other countries beginning in the 15th century, most notably the Spanish conquest. This era brought about a period of detriment that defined the concept of colonialism, as there was an implementation of ideologies alongside it, such as separatism, Eurocentricity, and religious backed exceptionalism. As these countries would put their sights on different civilizations, it would create the perfect breeding ground for imperialism, imposing their self determined morals, values, and customs. The oppressors soon got better at ruling over others, developing more complex methods of maintaining control. With this came the malicious idea to manipulate others' images. If you can convince someone that their culture, looks, and ways of life do not fit what is right, you can not only justify the cruel treatment they receive, but you also pacify their resistance. If a group internalized the hatred spewed at them, they would not see themselves as worthy of control over their lives, or rather, worthy of sovereignty. Fast forwarding to the most recent times of the 21st century, indigenous groups all over the world are still feeling the effects of colonization. But through collective action and resistance, steps have been made all over towards decolonizing. This resistance has taken on many forms, from legislative wins to physical reclamations of land, building their self governance brick by brick. However, an often overlooked battlefield, yet just as, if not more, crucial as the topics aforementioned, the battle to regain control over their social perception, representations, and self definition. In this video, we will discuss three theoretical frameworks: rhetorical sovereignty, visual sovereignty, and sonic sovereignty. And with this, we will analyze how modern indigenous media has been instrumentalized for the goal of reclaiming their self determination through the creation of authentic representations and unfiltered denouncements against the oppressors. The ability to choose what you would like to express, how to express it, and not be met with an authoritative figure who denies your agency while coercing you to their self determined right methods is a struggle many, fortunately, do not know. However, indigenous populations have often faced this debilitating scenario for centuries as a result of the colonial era, which brought many imperialist nations to these lands. Among them were English settlers who were fleeing imperial rule, settling here and stealing land to create what is known today as the United States, becoming the subjugators of indigenous peoples. Through unilateral control, they dictated the perceived identity, methods of living, and communication practices of the native communities. In his article, Rhetorical Sovereignty: What Do American Indians Want from Writing?, Scott Richard Lyons discusses the history and development of the perpetrated acts against the indigenous peoples by the United States government. He highlights broad colonial patterns but also brings attention towards specific events as well, such as the Carlisle Indian School's native children who were coerced to take on white names, Chief Justice John Marshall's pronouncement of the Cherokee Nation status to be rewritten within the U.S. legislation as a domestic dependent nation, and even analyzing legal cases such as Worcester versus Georgia's, and the phrasing that likens these nations to a ward or pupil, page 452 of the Lyons article. However, what all these depersonalizing acts share is that they stem from the rhetorical imperialism of the United States government, eliminating the native through legislation, forced assimilation, and control of communicative means. Within this article, Lyons also introduces a term he coined, rhetorical sovereignty, which he defines as inherent right an ability of peoples to determine their own communicative needs and desires in this pursuit, to decide for themselves the goals, modes, styles, and languages of public discourse. Lyon's article, page 449 to 450. Over time, the indigenous have taken to resisting this rhetorical imperialism, seeking to regain agency over their legal personhood and recognition as a nation independent of the United States, championing for alternative legislation that better represents their sovereignty, advocating for what the teaching of indigenous history should look like, and rethinking the terms of debate. This ongoing resistance is evident in contemporary works such as the short film The Mystery of Now, directed by Audrey Buchanan and produced by the Woods Production, and the Native Governance Center's public service announcement, What is Tribal Sovereignty? Both works utilize visual art and commentary to challenge the settlers' hegemonic and limiting communicative practices. Their unconventional rhetorical methods deconstruct colonial conditioning while simultaneously reclaiming their rhetorical autonomy, showcasing Lyon's notion of rhetorical sovereignty throughout modern media. The Native Governance Center's public service announcement, What is Tribal Sovereignty? Shows Lyon's concept of rhetorical sovereignty by reclaiming authority over historical and political narratives through declarative legal language. Early in the PSA, the narrator firmly states, tribal nations have been sovereign since time immemorial. Sovereignty is not granted, but recognized. From timestamp 49 seconds to 57 seconds. This phrasing immediately rejects the framework of the settler, who treats sovereignty as a privilege given by the US government. Lyons notes that the imperialist use of writing by white powers has been vital in the deterioration of the American Indians' national sovereignty, quoted from page 453 of the Lyons article. In this context, the PSA responds directly to that historical imperialism by redefining what sovereignty is, rather using indigenous terms. Instead of appealing for recognition, it asserts the pre-existing sovereignty that the natives have always claimed, rather reversing the roles in the hierarchy, speaking to their will, having the United States listen. The PSA continues its rhetorical deconstruction through its legal framing. The line, treaties are the supreme law of the land. The United States government's frequent violations of its treaty obligations do not change that. Quoted from timestamps a minute 34 to a minute 44. This calls out the government of the United States, using the settler state's own legal language to point out its hypocrisy and unlawful acts. This strategic usage of settlers' legal language exemplifies what Lyons desired from rhetorical sovereignty, where the native asserts its own voice into the legislation, speaking or writing in an ongoing context of colonization, setting at least some of the terms of debate. Quoted partially from Lyons, page 462. By turning on the legal weight of treaties, the PSA positions indigenous nations not as subordinate, dependent nations, but as equal powers and bodies of government, whose rights are in legislation and whose interpretation of those treaties is authoritative. This action reflects what Lyons describes when discussing indigenous re-arguments of historical legal discussions on page 463, where indigenous communities and legal officials fight against colonial legal texts, asserting their own interpretations and sovereignty. Through these rhetorical moves of reclaiming legal language and asserting indigenous historical authority, the PSA actively practices rhetorical sovereignty. It counters centuries of rhetorical imperialism by inserting indigenous voice into legislation and discourses on their own terms, while also educating broader masses. Its use of commentary and declarative voice works to deconstruct the dominant settler native narrative that positioned indigenous peoples as dependent on U.S. authority, reclaiming their narrative and identity as an independent nation simultaneously. Audrey Buchanan's short film, The Mystery of Now, enacts rhetorical sovereignty through personal commentary, communal teaching, and storytelling. showcasing how indigenous communities reclaim communicative agency outside colonial frameworks. In the film, Douglas Miles, founder of Apache Skateboards, described his reaction to being photographed. I quote, "When I travel, I sometimes get my photo taken, and people always say, 'Okay, smile.' And I think to myself, why do I gotta smile? After 500 years of American gangsterism, you wouldn't be smiling either." Quoted from the timestamps, 1 minute to 1 minute 13. Here, Miles resists a settler imposed performative act. He is expected to smile, to appear harmless, and to conform to norms. This act exemplifies Miles' right and autonomy, rejecting the performative expectations placed upon him by non native photographers, who implicitly expect a friendly, palatable response or to conform. His refusal simultaneously undermines the representation of a submissive American Indian and condemns the settler through the negative identification as gangsters, who utilize violence to subjugate and colonize. He does not shy away from sharing the generational trauma and detriment that the settler has left behind. This reframe in the interaction allows him to claim ownership of his narrative, sharing the evident, long lasting truth through his smile refusal. This everyday act of resistance becomes a powerful rhetorical strategy, embodying sovereignty Lyons describes. The film further engages rhetorical sovereignty through communal education. Miles explains, "The Apache people were one of the last tribes to fight the westward expansion. That's the kind of history we taught our kids, and I always put that in my work," quoting from the timestamps 412 to 421. This commitment to passing on Indigenous history through art aligns with Lyon's vision of true Native education, which, I quote, "rejects any division between school climate and culture and community climate and culture," end quote, replacing imposed hierarchical modes of education with a community-centered narrative, quoted from the Lyons article, page 464. Miles' work functions to sustain cultural memory, an alternative to the colonial education model designed to assimilate Native children. It is a direct counter to the use of rhetoric with imperialist motives. It revolves around the ancestral form of communication and teachings that the indigenous value and that the settler sought to erase. By grounding rhetorical teaching through different unconventional modes, the film and Miles reject colonial modes of communication altogether, asserting a fully indigenous rhetorical framework. While the PSA and the Mystery of Now differ in medium and rhetorical mode, with one taken on legal diction and the other on art and cultural storytelling, both enact rhetorical sovereignty as defined by Lyons. The PSA reclaims and redefines legal language to assert sovereignty, while the Mystery of Now foregrounds Indigenous voice and community education to sustain sovereignty. Together, they demonstrate the multifaceted strategies of rhetorical sovereignty, which reject the rhetorical imperialist. Morals, practices, traditions, beliefs. These are all factors that have constituted a group of people since time immemorial. Which of these elements consist of varies from group to group, allowing for distinct cultures and civilizations. These are passed down through generations, from those nearing their end to the successors, in hopes that this wisdom they offer not only ensures the community endures the test of time, but also brings about flourishing. Observation and inspection of these compositions offers a pretty good understanding of their people and their way of life. However, one does not have total autonomy over how the world perceives them. Word of mouth, documentation, media, these can all be altered, leaving out or completely butchering crucial information. Oftentimes, this may bring about inauthentic, false, and even detrimental narratives of certain groups. This misinformation can be internalized by outside individuals and even whole nations. With media and historical records playing large parts in disseminating how groups look or act, it can create unfair judgments, stereotyping, and dehumanizing rhetoric. With history being dictated by those with power, marginalized groups often have little say in their social perceptions, left to surrender to the hegemony or overcome the unfair playing field. Indigenous peoples have repeatedly been given this treatment by settler colonialists, judged through their bigoted lens. From the documentation by the Europeans who ventured to, I quote, civilize the savage, to the 20th century films with insulting representations, inclusivity has never been the forefront of the narrator's concerns, only adhered to the perspectives they could not be bothered to change. But from the crevices of these distorted portrayals, voices of defiance have risen. Artists who have devoted their craft as a vehicle of reclamation and resistance to the narrative. In the paper, reading Nanook Smile, Visual Sovereignty, Indigenous Revisions of Ethnography, and Atunajua, The Fast Runner, published in 2007 by Dr. Raheja, offers us an analytical perspective of past media that employed indigenous peoples. We are introduced to the notorious gramophone scene from Nanook of the North, made in 1922, where an Inuit hunter encounters a device, I quote, unknown. The reaction offers multiple understandings, each tailored to the group the viewer is most familiar with. What would seem to the general audience as a scene of confusion and ridicule of a hunter unfamiliar with modern technology, an Inuit watcher would read this as an elder vividly amused by the filmmaking process, laughing at the camera. From this article comes the coined term visual sovereignty, which could be understood as a reimagination of native-centered media and narratives done to offer a more authentic, inclusive, self-representative narrative, countering the hegemonic doctrine. Quoting from Dr. Raheja's article, page 1161. This concept forms the foundation for the analysis that follows, as indigenous artists and creators assert their agency through film, photography, and music, reclaiming representation and reasserting their cultural values in the face of historical misrepresentation. Through the works of photographer Cara Romero and the music video Stadium Powwow by the Hallucination, indigenous artists exercise visual sovereignty to dismantle colonial set narratives and take back the ownership of their image. By reimagining sacred iconography, revisiting past malpractice, and transforming modern media into tools of resistance, these creators challenge the enduring dominance of settler narratives and affirm indigenous values of community, relational morality, and connection to the land. Cara Romero's photography exemplifies Michelle Raheja's concept of visual sovereignty through her reimagination of settler iconography, offering a more true-to-culture depiction. In her piece, The Last Indian Market, Romero reimagines Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper by replacing Jesus with the buffalo, a figure of salvation and guidance deeply rooted in Native American culture and spiritual identity, taken from the video of Cara Romero from the timestamps 240 to 252. This substitution rejects the colonial ideology of worship inherent in Christian and Catholic iconography, then replacing it with the more authentic, ecocentric image based on indigenous morals, values, and practices. By doing so, Romero not only rejects the symbol of imposed worship, but reframes it with indigenous ideology that emphasizes community, balance, and a deep respect and connection to the land. As Raheja had pointed out when introducing examples of visual sovereignty through belt treaties, physical mediums are often symbolic and ensure mutual respect, taken from Raheja's article on page 1164. These materials, expressive mediums of treaty and values, hold greater significance and meaning than a written argument. These objects don't merely convey agreement or acknowledgement of coexistence, but they embody relationships, values, and respect in a much more tangible and memorable way. This act of reinterpreting the image acts as a form of visual sovereignty, offering an articulation more centered on authentic native values, creating a more culturally tied representation in its place, while displaying the core values that are often left out of mainstream narratives of the indigenous peoples. Romero's water memory further illustrates Raheja's idea of visual sovereignty by transforming digital media into an agent of condemnation and authentic narrative of historical events. The photograph responds to the flooding of the Chemehuevi Valley, where the United States hydroelectric project submerged homes, cemeteries, and vital resources beneath what is now Lake Havasu. She narrates, "Our area of subsistence, our ways of growing food, our basket weaving materials are now under the lake." I end quote. Concurrently shown is the art piece of two native people submerged underwater, dressed in cultural clothing, taking a portion of a plant with them as they sink. A statement that captures cultural grief and detriment, and an image that portrays the theft of their future. Image taken from the Caramero video, 110 to 120 timestamp. By using digital tools and layered imagery, Romero invokes what Rahesia describes as a practice utilizing digital tools to stage oral and indigenous techniques of time and space, with mediums that foster true representation without limitations of the format. Romero's use of digital techniques mirrors this approach, as she manipulates visual space through editing to convey the simultaneity of past detriment and a future devoid of sustenance and growth for the indigenous community that relied on the land. The result is a visual retelling inclusive of all generations who were impacted by the negligence of the United States. Through this fusion of technology and figures of traditional peoples, Romero's water memory transcends mere documentation. It becomes an act of reclamation, preserving knowledge of the historical wrongdoings by the United States and resisting the colonial narrative that seeks to bury them beneath progress. Throughout the late 20th and early 21st centuries, it seems apparent that there is a consensus, at least amongst the uninformed, regarding indigenous communities' methodologies and way of life to be reminiscent of prior times, or rather, frozen in the past, accompanied by a minimization of the tragedy specific to these peoples. Whether these views concurrently developed as a result of the strategic omission of contemporary indigenous communities in our sites of education, its curriculum, and media, or simply mass bigotry, what can be said is this. Ultimately, the indigenous communities have suffered from inadequate, authentic portrayals and documentation, but they are rather plagued by excessive misrepresentation of their culture and the graveness of their past events. Over the past 5 years, there has been a vast influx of media in the creative field that promote indigenous centered narratives. From Netflix owing numerous of its hit series these past years to native narratives, podcasts that discuss the differentiation in production under indigenous creatives, and even documentaries that condemn the persecution acted out by authoritative religious groups and governments. Native producers have spread their voice across various formats. Liz Perbilski, an interdisciplinary scholar of mainstream music and hip hop, the author of Sonic Sovereignty, Hip Hop, Indigeneity, and Shifting Popular Music Mainstreams, published in 2023, combines analysis and anecdotal development of music, incorporating its significance to ongoing resistance and socio political issues. Within the introduction, we are given the goal this book holds. Through analysis of our discussion with indigenous media contemporaries and an unraveling of the possibilities of implementing sound into self identity and determination, this book offers the concept of sonic sovereignty, the act of expressing indigenous ideals and culture through the practice of sound, taken from Przybylski's quote on page 4. Whilst numerous indigenous activists have taken upon the task of identity liberation and truth telling through various means of media, two artists specifically engage in creative practices that evoke Przybylski's concept of sonic sovereignty. Frank Wan, a Lakota musician, and Lisa Jackson, film writer and director, utilize contemporary media formats while incorporating indigenous heritage and history. They become indicative of Native people's keenness to adopt revolutionary innovations and the generational pain that has not dissolved. Through strategic utilization of lyrics, elusive instrumentals, and curation of community and identity, Wan and Jackson contribute to the collective production of authentic representations necessary in challenging the narrative, whilst also simultaneously dismantling the predominant detrimental perception. YouTube channel Pop Cause. The YouTube channel Pop Cause, in their series Originals First, interviewed Frank Wan, the young Lakota who was brought up in South Dakota, on his music production and how it interacts with his identity. Firstly, Wan takes us alongside his trip to the Field Museum in Chicago, Illinois, more specifically, through the section for Indigenous Artifacts and Peoples. He walks amongst displayed artifacts such as masks, weapons, and ceremonial clothing and makeshift scenes of tribal gatherings portrayed through minuscule figures. Wan is sure not to shy away from the criticism he holds of the practice of portraying indigenous peoples these ways, already underrepresented in such ways. These artifacts on display for the people's pleasure are sacred belongings for indigenous tribes, all that is left for them from their ancestors, but rather they're displayed, dispossessed, and misused for show. Wan believes this overt showcasing alludes to the viewer that they are observing past people who do not live in the contemporary world, and more specifically, an act of symbolic annihilation, rendering his ancestors as a group frozen in the past, also completely invalidating any connection to the contemporary community has to these peoples. Or worst case scenario, just completely validating them. And this is shown from Wan on timestamp 43 seconds to a minute in the video. And this is not an idiosyncratic take either, as Wan confirms that it's a shared sentiment amongst his community members. Wan's childhood was plagued by the all too common imperialist derived detriments that undermine marginalized children: single parent household, bad relationship with an absent father, and the looming sense of alienation, taking on the world without much direction. Almost like a gesture of fate, the lonely child would cross paths with an entity who understood the struggles, acknowledgement, guidance, and ultimately a call to purpose and passion. This entity was a scratched out CD playing Eminem's LP that touched on topics Juan resonated with his entire life. Juan would share how this event shaped his purpose, finding fulfillment in a path paved by hip hop music. Juan focuses in on the sentiment, sharing the role that he wishes to fill, explaining, for kids back home to see somebody who looks like them, someone who comes from these communities, born and raised in the same place as they are, to follow their passion, quoted from Juan in the timestamp, 3:05 to 3 minutes and 13 seconds. From finding an artist who shared his lived struggle, being filled with that sense of camaraderie, Juan determined his purpose was to be that same figure for the next generation of youth in his community. Juan invokes Przybylski's sonic sovereignty, more specifically, through his strategic utilization of the inherent qualities within hip hop. As stated by Przybylski on page 14, it continues to reinvent itself, look back toward foundational techniques, and engage local issues and communities globally, taken from Przybylski's article on page 14. As a young Lakota man who proudly embodies his identity, shares his upbringing, and does so on a format best capable of speaking on harsh realities, Juan not only serves as an authentic figure for younger generations, also sheds light on the shared ordeal through integration of his upbringing. Sonic sovereignty calls for adequate representation, blatant with their identity, culture, and values. Juan answers, providing the younger generation with a figure who simultaneously understands it represents the Native community in the music industry. Juan then goes on to address the primary question of the interview, his personal intersection of music and identity, to which he answers, and I quote, I really try to create something unique in that I blend a lot of traditional sounds, elements, philosophies, textures, with a more familiar contemporary music form, which is hip hop. Quoted from the Juan video, 2 minutes to 2 minutes and 14 seconds. Throughout this interview, the directors cut in snippets of Juan's music, with one lyric specifically standing out. I've got that Aboriginal soul, delivered in the form of rhythm, rhyme, and poetry, supported with the traditional rap beat constituted by snares, breaks, and a catchy beat. While the overt pride of his heritage throughout the lyrics is worthy of attention in itself, there is something much more crucial at play here. On page 7 of Przybylski's article, she states, shaping an urban indigenous community image through popular broadcasts in the face of popular media's history of erasure and active stereotyping is part of asserting that sovereignty that must be recognized. Page 7. Juan is not simply flaunting his identity through this spectacle of prowess. He is actively rebelling against his people's symbolic annihilation. Weaving together an upbeat, technological, instrumental, lyrics boasting his culture, composing the fundamentals of his identity, or soul if you'd rather, all while still proudly displaying his heritage through his appearance, it creates a symphony that quells the mass-produced song of bigotry. The consensus that deems Lakotas and many other tribes' culture and practices to be of the past, stagnant, and antiquated is shattered by Juan's skillful display. For a descendant of a people of the past, to claim identity through an amalgamation of modern media techniques is the ultimate material rebuttal. Savage, a short film written and directed by Lisa Jackson, follows a young Native girl driven away from her home, whilst a woman singing in the kitchen resurfaces throughout, changing the tone upon our protagonist's arrival at their new home, a boarding school already occupied with other children who shared a similar fate. Taken at face value, this can be interpreted as a mere portrayal of past trauma, then given a bizarre, unwarranted twist of kidnapped children dancing uniformly to electric funk. But this view would invalidate the effort and complexity Jackson packed into the short film. Through instrumental analysis and a critical gaze that questions Jackson's choreographic and audio direction, what unravels is a call for reaction and collective resistance. Initially, we're met with a shot of the scenic countryside, only beautified by the sunrise that covers the land in a dim warmth. In the background, morning birds chirp, a soft guitar picks up faintly, complemented by a mother singing in the Cree language. Jackson knew what she was doing with this combination. We, the viewers, are lured into a nostalgic tranquility reminiscent of home as a child. The sun hugs us as our mother's voice cradles our mind and body. For many, this type of peace was only found in the naivety exclusive to childhood. To have these instrumentals dissipate whilst our protagonist undergoes a makeover that strips her of any appearances relative to her home is not an accident. Abruptly, our comfort is snatched. All instrumentals come to a stop, with heavier, intimidating drums suggestive of militaristic band formations take over, as our soft guitar transitions to electric with sharp highs. On page 7 of Sonic Sovereignty, Przybylski shares that sonic sovereignty is also, I quote, about storytelling and exploring how musical expression is framed. End of quote. Jackson strategically manipulated the viewer's emotions to bring them into the roller coaster of emotion and trauma that the integration of boarding schools brought. Through a masterful mixture of visuals and audio that ensured the viewer would be swayed into tranquility, the abrupt change in music delivered the blow she had planned for. This juxtaposition had a poignant effect that aids the viewer in truly comprehending the cruelty and horrific experience of a child taken away from their serenity and thrown into horrific institutions. Undertaking the storytelling aspect of Przybylski's sonic sovereignty, Jackson tackled the undesirable, yet necessary task of resurfacing suppressed trauma, distilling its brevity into the viewer's mind through meticulous sound choices. While we, the viewers, are still disturbed by this emotional sound exhibition, Jackson does not falter from throwing a curveball, giving us an unexpected choreography enacted by the very children we just felt remorseful towards a minute ago. In the absence of their teacher, all students, without any prior planning or rehearsal, suddenly burst into a flash mob accompanied by an electric funk tone. While initially this may come off as uncalled for and, if you may, insensitive to the sorrowful scene we just saw, Jackson's decision was not constituted simply by shock value, but rather as a form of rebellion and call for collective reaction. On page 6 of Sonic Sovereignty, Przybylski informs the reader of the significance of the silence. Once acting with self-determination, one has full agency over who to communicate with and who's left out. One can even dictate the convenience behind the communication. These children have yet to speak amongst each other, but once given the opportunity, they simultaneously explode into synchronization. No words are spoken, so the viewer has no overt rhetoric to decide to understand this phenomenon. But that's precisely the point. These individual children, ripped from their heaven and thrown into hell, communicate through a method that excludes outsiders. The shared trauma that will haunt them forever sparks a flame that calls for revolt through collective reaction. To quote page 6 once again from Przybylski, choosing who can hear, who should witness, who can have a chance to understand, to participate, and who cannot, choosing what to tell and what to keep, creating moments of no sound, no information, and letting the space do work through silent non communication, all of this is how individuals and groups can express power. If you can comprehend another person's suffering, there is no need to explain with words why the actions they take are necessary. United through trauma forged bonds, solidarity was created, all acting as one for the goal of rejection and reclamation of their stripped identity. Within the ongoing effort to demolish the media's representation of indigenous peoples, with elements being the false depiction as a stagnated culture, downplay of past tragedy, our selected artists have been pretty evocative of sovereignty through sound praxis. Our Lakota hip hop MC Frank Wan utilized one of the most renowned media formats to speak on socio political issues prevalent in his community, all while showing pride in his identity. Not only did he give the younger generation a figure of representation and validation, but he also invalidates that people of the past trope by integrating his cultural value and practices into arguably the most innovative audio format, rap. Lisa Jackson masterfully conveys the devastating occurrence of the boarding school persecution to the reader, luring them in to experience a fragment of the emotional dynamics, coercing the viewer to comprehend the severity of one of the numerous horrific events specific to their community. Through sound, these producers disprove false consensuses, replacing them with genuine representations, playing their part in the re-illustration of their true past and cultural presence. In what originated as an overtaking of the land, subjugating its people, the development of colonialism evolved into a much more complex ruling system that included cultural imperialism. With innovations came adaptation from the oppressor, utilizing new means for the manipulation of the image of the indigenous minority. However, the resistance followed suit. utilizing these very same vessels to rebut the falsehoods, reimagine the general population's perception, and provide proper, genuine renditions that do not misrepresent the community. In offering their own spin on a public service announcement and short film, they've practiced their agency in the matter of rhetoric. They use terminology selected to best serve their people, while also giving unapologetic critiques on the oppressor's governance being reminiscent of violent gangs. Ingenious recreation in the visual media format, reimagining European symbolism to represent indigenous heritage, and invoking Rahage's noted importance of visuals, where a reservation barricader proudly displayed their resistance to be just as physical as it is mental. Our composers have wielded the power of song to exemplify the profound presence of indigenous people in the modern day, furthermore utilizing it meticulously in ways that will only convey multifaceted understandings and messages to their desired audience. Our redeemers have all contributed to the mission of decolonization, tackling different aspects of sovereignty, ultimately acting towards a more accurate, just image of indigenous peoples worldwide.